We're going to look at hand stitching today. Now, we very rarely do hand stitching. Well, I don't want to say rarely. Other than closures, it's not very often that we're doing hand stitching and costuming just because of the time element. But there are some times where hand stitching is just what it needs to be in order to get the best finish that we want. Most often these are some type of hem stitching, or it's some type of thing where you're applying some type of applique, or just securing something down. What we're going to focus on today is essentially some hem stitches. The primary one will be the first one we're going to do, which is the blind stitch. I will then show you the cross stitch, which we use in a couple of different applications. I'll show you one version, and then we'll look at a second version, and then our extra credit option will be the slip stitch. Slip stitches is what you use to, say, close a pillow or a seam or something where you've left a seam open and you need for some reason to get that back closed. All right, so because what we're essentially doing is simulating a hem, I'm going to prepare my 6x6 square as if it's a hem on a garment. So say this is a pant leg or a skirt bottom or a sleeve, right? When you're hemming, you're basically turning the raw edge up so that it's on the inside of the fabric, and so on the outside we've got a finished edge. We don't have these frayed edges happening here. And when we have a hem, you can choose to do what's called a top stitch hem, which we'll do on the machine, where you're going to see a line of stitching across here, kind of like when we did the flat felled seam. That finish was essentially kind of showed up as top stitching on the outside of the garment. But most often you don't want that to be featured. Now, also on stage, you're also going to be what we often say is 30 feet away and wiggling. So we do want to have quality construction, but we also are aware that that the audience isn't going to be scrutinizing these things very closely. So if you've got a good matching thread, sometimes you can get away with a top stitch because you can't see it from the audience. However, if you truly don't want that hem to show, then you're going to use matching thread and you'll do a blind stitch. You can do a blind stitch on the sewing machine, but it takes a little practice to get it prepared and to get it set up properly. And there are actually, as I mentioned before in one of our lectures, there's also blind stitching machines that you're often going to see at a tailor shop or an alteration shop, where that it's just set up to do a blind hem, and they'll often use what we call invisible thread, which is kind of like super thin, super fine fishing line. But this is about hand stitching, so we're going to do a hand blind hem. All right, so we've folded this up, and when you mark on the actor what the length is, that's going to tell you how much to turn up. If it's a shaped hem, you want to have a smaller, a less deep hem, because it's going to have to go around curves and things. If it's a straight hem, which is what we're hopefully going to be dealing with most of the time, then the depth is negligible, except for being able to kind of see where that hits from the audience. It could look a little odd if the hem is too deep, but the deeper the hem, the more alterability, and therefore the better it is for your stock. It's less an issue on skirts than it is with pants, especially tailored men's suits. If you get this hem too deep, then it can look a little odd as it's when it's hanging on his leg, or if you fold it down multiple times so it gets too thick, that could also be odd. So there's a balance in finding the right amount of hem you can keep while also making sure that the finished product looks correct. I found that number is roughly about a 4 to 5 inch hem you can usually accommodate in pants. You can get even deeper with a skirt, but if you push it much more above 5, then you're going to have just a lot of bulk to deal with, and it's going to be hitting on a strange place. So that's just a general rule of thumb. All right, so one of the things I want to talk about is, this right here being a raw edge, we also don't want these little frays to happen while they're inside the pant. So you're either going to finish this edge with a serger, or we will fold this edge down so that it's encased inside the seam, so we have all finished edges, okay? We're going to do this with the fold down, and you just have to remember that if you're folding down something inside, you have to allow for that when you're turning up a hem, right? So say this hem is 1.5 inch hem, and I turn this down and then I measure 1.5 inches. I've just made that about 1/4 of an inch or 3/8 of an inch even shorter, right? So if I want this to be 1.5 inch hem, then I'll probably want to mark my 1.5 inches and then do my fold down, or just subtract that as you're going along, okay? All right, so you mark your hem, how deep it has to be. You make the allowance for that turn down at the top if you're not serging. And then sometimes you press that in place. I'm kind of doing a little finger press to help it hold in place, but we definitely do want to pin this so that as we're working it doesn't shift and we don't end up with an uneven hem. Uneven hems is a very, very fast way to have things look crooked and wrong and hard to see. All right, so we've prepared a hem, and again, very often this is, like I was talking about with the ruffles, this is usually going to be on something circular because you've got a pant leg or a skirt or a sleeve, and those are generally a tube shape. Some tubes are wider, like skirts, and some tubes are narrower, like sleeves. But the process is still going to be same regardless of if it's flat or if it's round or how deep the hem is. All right, so we're going to take our thread, much like we did with the closures. You want a long enough thread that you have enough to work with without stopping frequently to rethread. However, you don't want it so long that it continues to be an issue. All right. Oh, got to get those ends even. Tie our knot. Just a refresher, I lay the needle on my finger, pinch the thread in between. I wrap the thread around a few times and then just slide that through. You can do a knot however you would like to. That's just the way that I do them. I'm not going to be, obviously not going to be looking over your shoulder to see how you're making your knots because I'm not there. All right. Oh, well, it doesn't help when the first thing you do is knot your own thread. So when this happens, I'll just kind of try to get my needle in there to help me pull these threads away from one another. So if I can't get this undone, then I'm going to have to cut this off and start all over. So what happened is my thread just got looped inside itself and it tried to make a new knot, and I said no, and I fixed it. So sometimes that'll happen, and you just have to, it just takes a little patience to try to work that out. I wanted to leave that in and show it to you so you know that that happens to everyone, and you can just take a minute to fix it. Or if you don't want to deal with it, you just cut that thread off and rethread it. All right, starting for our blind hem. I am right-handed, so I will be traveling from right to left. If you're left-handed, then it'll be the same thing. You'll just travel from left to right. Now when we get started, we're going to get started just the same way we did with our closures. Now I'm going to start at the very end here, and I'm going to start inside what would be the hem. Okay, so we're starting the same as usual. I am thread challenged this morning. Okay, so we have our initial knot in there. Now I'm going to make my loop to create my starter knot. All right, now if you look on Blackboard at the instruction sheets for this, the pattern for this is our thread is going to go from our hem into the pant leg straight across, then we're going to travel back to the hem and then go straight across. So we're going over, we're going across, over, across, over. All right, so wherever this knot is, I'm going to go directly into the pant leg on the other side. And notice I'm taking a very tiny, tiny bite, just like we do when we make our knots. So if we look on this side, you can see just that tiniest bit of metal right there. Now when this is I'm using contrasting thread so that you can see the stitch better, but what you're generally going to do is try to match your thread to your fabric as closely as possible so that when we do have matching thread, ideally you're not going to see that tiny bite on the outside, and that bite could even be smaller. You could, especially if you've got thicker material, you could get in there and really just pick up 2 or 3 threads. All right, so we've come straight across, we've taken our little bite, and now we're just going to collapse that straight down. Okay, I'm going to take this pin out, and generally we're working inside this hem, so I'm going to just fold that little edge back a little so I can continue to work. I've moved straight across. Now I want to travel down and come back across into my hem, and I want to travel about 1/4 of an inch. You can go a little longer, but the closer together these are, the less likely you are to have anything impede with the hem, something getting caught in it like a heel, etc. All right, so if we see that pattern, we've come straight across and we traveled down. So now I'm going to come straight across again back into my pant leg, very small bite. I want that to be flat. Okay, so I've come across and now I'm going to travel over back into my hem, straight across, tiny bite. You can do this in one motion as you kind of get in the habit of it. All right, so we're just repeating this over and over, straight across. As I come down, I want to open that edge up again. All right, so can you see that little pattern that's developing there? And what I'm going to be looking for is consistency. I want to see that you have about the same size stitches, you're taking a very small bite, and that your distance between the stitches is approximately the same. So that's going to be part of my grading criteria, is that consistency. Now if we look on the outside here, you see these very, very small stitches, right? And the farther you get, the harder those are to see. And if you can imagine that that was matching thread, they'd be even harder. I think my camera's trying to focus on too many things, right? So you can barely see those. And that's what we want. And when we look over here, say I've folded that edge up, we can't really see the stitches from the inside hem either because they're tucked inside. All right, so that's just how we do that. I'm going to complete this so you can just kind of see the pattern continue to grow and emerge. And I find one of the trickiest parts for people to get is really getting that directly across, so those two, that your two stitches are in the same place, just in two different parts of the fabric. Little bite, travel over, little bite, directly across, little bite, travel over. Now I'm going to show you a slight variation. Right, so we've got our bite, we've traveled over. Now a lock stitch is the exact same pattern. The difference is, instead of when I come across, instead of going over, if I come back in under the thread that just went in, if I come under that and do my bite, I've created a lock stitch. And that just basically means there's kind of a little knot in each stitch, so it's a little more secure. But it's the same pattern. You're just coming underneath the fabric, the thread. All right, so we've done the same thing. All right. Let's get on down to the end. Across, tiny bite, travel. Across, tiny bite, travel. And if you've got extremely lightweight or delicate fabrics that you want to do this on, there's another stitch called a roll stitch, which I'm not going to go through because it's so rare that we use that on stage. That's something you're going to use more in apparel sewing. But if you're doing very lightweight fabrics, I do have a double thread here. I almost always use a double thread, but if it's super lightweight, very delicate, you can do this exact same stitch with a single thread. You just won't line up your tails when you're preparing it. You're just only going to tie the knot on one side. All right, so now I'm coming to the end. I've taken my little bite. I've traveled across. Oh, hi. Of course, right there at the end, you want to be ornery. Okay, now I'm in my hem side, and make sure that's flat. I'm going to go across back into the pant and do my tiny bite. The difference is I'm not traveling into anything from there. So I've got these two guys. I'm going to come back across into the hem side, and then I'm going to finish it off like I did with my closures. I'm going to take a little bite, so I create a loop for myself, pass my needle through the loop. You can do a couple of knots if you want. I almost always do. And then if you're going to bury the tail, you'll need to do that in the hem side. All right, and that, everyone, is our blind hem. And hopefully you can see why it's called a blind hem. It's virtually unseen. Like I said, if that bite's a little big. But if this was matching thread, we would not even see this stitching. Okay. There's our blind hem. And if you look inside, and that's how I'm going to grade. I'm going to look inside here and see if I can see that pattern where you're coming directly across and then traveling. Okay. Blind hem. Next we're going to do the cross stitch. Now the cross stitch is something that I use most often. I don't tend to use it when hemming, but if I have a piece of bias or decorative trim that I'm finishing a garment with, okay. Sometimes she takes a little bit to catch up on the focusing. Okay. So say I've trimmed something with some bias or with some piping, and I need to fold that edge up and have it be secure. I could do a blind hem, but especially if you're using heavier fabrics and you kind of want it to just really lay flat, you might use a cross stitch. You can also use a cross stitch in between two layers like this. That's something that you'll see fairly often in tailoring when you're stitching a lining to the outside of a garment, because it gives a little bit more, some give, so that those pieces can shift some. All right, because we're treating this is essentially as a hem stitch, you're going to want a finished edge, so either that's going to be serged or you're going to turn that under. I most often with a cross stitch will work with a serged edge, because one of the things we're doing is trying to get it as flat as possible, and that's why we're kind of cross stitch, which goes over. All right, so we've got to have that raw edge under, since we aren't serging in this example. We'll just get that pressed down. Finger press. Finger press. All right, pin that. Now what may be initially confusing about this stitch, so being right-handed, as I said, that the blind hem, I was traveling from right to left with my stitching. Now the confusing part about the cross stitch is whichever way you're traveling, you're starting at the opposite end, right? So the direction of my stitches and the direction that I'm traveling are going to be opposites, which sounds fairly complicated, but it's not really. That's a very uneven hem. If you would like to measure that, you can. I'm not going to count off, but it would be nice if your hem was the same depth from beginning to end. And measuring devices help that happen. Okay, I've prepared my hem. Now, like I said, normally when I'm sewing, I'll be traveling from right to left. For cross stitch, I'm going to be starting at the left and traveling to the right. However, my stitching is still going to go from right to left. And if you're left-handed, this is the opposite. Okay. Now, I'm still going to start same way. I'm going to start inside my hem, establish my knot, make the loop, collapse the knot. Okay, now instead of traveling across here, I'm going to travel from left to right, but I'm going to take a stitch from right to left. Now this is a much larger bite, so it's going to show more on the outside. I would normally, if I'm using this in this manner, I would be taking a smaller bite, but I'm taking a larger bite now to kind of demonstrate how that pattern works. Pins are very helpful and sometimes very in the way. Okay, so I've my needle passes that direction. Now I'm going to travel across. I'm going to come from the outside of the leg over on top into the hem. I'll take about a 1/4 inch bite. I'm going to try to end about the same place where the one above it started. And now I'm going to do the same thing up here. And you'll see very shortly why it's called the cross stitch. So essentially we're creating a series of X's. Like I said, this is not ideal when the top part is a single thread, because we don't want this to show on the outside like this. Generally, you're going to do it if there's another layer of fabric, like you're sewing this to a lining, or it's thick enough that you can kind of skim to the inside. But that's what we're doing. We're crossing the thread to create a series of X's. And like I said, the advantage of this is it kind of sits on top and encases that hem a little more. It covers it up. Now, if I wanted to use this in a blind stitch type manner so that it's not showing on the outside, I can do this exact same pattern. I can just take smaller bites. Right, so when I come up here, I could take a very tiny bite like I did with my blind hem and do the same thing here. So I'm still creating that same pattern. It's just not quite as obvious because my crosses aren't as deep. Then it looks more like a V than an X. So this is your second required stitch. You can have large ones like this, or you can treat it like a hem. Have these smaller ones more like V's. But the key in this one is that the direction your needle is moving and the direction you're traveling are actually opposites. You're traveling toward yourself. All right, so now when I want to finish, I want to complete my stitch, complete my pattern on the outside here, and then instead of traveling over, I'm going to come up and I'm going to come back across into the external part of the garment, but down very close to my hem edge. And then I can just fold this back and take my little bite to make my knot. Ooh, that was a big bite, little bite. Oh no, my loop got too small too fast. Little bite. And if your thread's too short to go front to back with your needle, you can go back to front. All right. And then if I want to bury my tail, I want to go into the hem side. All right, that's our cross stitch. There you go. So these are our two required stitches, hand stitches, our blind stitch and our cross stitch. And again, with the cross stitch, whether you take larger bites or smaller bites, that's not what I'm concerned with as much as I want to see that you recognize that stitch pattern and that you have a consistent distance between your stitches. I got a little off there, but for the most part, it's fairly consistent. All right, so those are our required stitches. And now we've got our slip stitch. And the slip stitch, like I said, that's something that we use most often to kind of close up pillows, or if for some reason you've had to open a seam and you need to close it back, this is something that you could do for that. Okay, so to simulate an open seam, we need 2 folded edges. So we're going to fold this, the top and the bottom, and then just fold this in half so our folded edges are together, right? Because if we've created a seam that we then need to close, it would be stitched together already at some portion, and then there'll be an opening we'd have to deal with where the raw edges are inside. All right. So you fold the edges down to create that folded edge. To simulate that open seam that needs to be closed. All right, this thread is clearly too short. We'll be threading that again. I missed. There we go. Now this one's a little hard to see the pattern because all of our stitching is going to be inside those folded edges. So we'll start inside really close to that fold with our tiny bite as usual. Our second tiny bite to start our knot. So the path for this is very, very similar to the blind hem. So I've started here and I'm going to travel directly across into the other side. So I want to be as absolute true to directly across as I can be. I'm going to put that needle in there and I'm traveling. I don't know if you can kind of see where the needle is moving there. I'm traveling inside that folded, that fold there. Okay. And I want to I'm going to travel very, very short, 1/16 or 1/8 of an inch at the most. And you keep that thread and that needle and that thread very near the surface of the fold. This thread is not liking me very much today. Okay. All right. So now I'm going to come directly across again and travel just a very short ways down that hem. And keep that flat. We don't want it to bunch up. And again, directly across. So the goal here is to mimic a seam that's been sewn on the machine. So when you sew on the machine and you look at that seam from the outside, you're just seeing the lock part of that lock stitch, right? All right, so you see those tiny little, just right there and there. That's what we're trying to create. So this is your slip stitch. Now there's a stitch I haven't talked about that is called the whip stitch, W-H-I-P, whip stitch. If I just gave you a needle and thread and told you to sew something with it, chances are what you're going to be doing is the whip stitch. There's also a chain stitch. There's also if you have to sew a seam by hand, there's kind of some backtracking that happens. And we just use those so rarely. I don't know that they're necessary to learn in this introductory level. It's something that if it's needed, chances are someone's going to be there to show it to you. You don't want that loop. You want it all to be nice and flat. So I hope you can see what's happening here. Get that camera focus better. So we're just creating, so it should just look like we've sewn a seam on the machine and we're looking at it from the outside. Right? Directly across, travel down the fold. Yeah, chain stitch is more of a decorative kind of embroidery stitch. This loop keeps wanting to come back on me. Don't like it. You don't want it to bunch like that either. Just flatten it out. This feels very tedious. You can take bigger stitches, but the reality is the bigger those stitches are that you take, if this is something that's been stuffed like a pillow or whatever, you're creating more opportunity for that filling to kind of push back out through the gaps in the stitching. So that's why it's important for these to be nice small stitches. Unless, of course, you're doing something temporary just to hold it in place, then it can be like a basting stitch and have a longer length. But once again, we would, in reality, be using matching thread and just doing the contrast. So you can see what's happening, hopefully. See, when those look uneven right there. This one's taking longer than the others because I've got such tiny stitches to make it right. So I think you kind of get the idea behind this. We'll go ahead and tie this off here. So in order to finish it, we're going to come directly across like we were making a new stitch, just instead of closing that loop, just pass your needle through to make the knot. And then if you wanted to do another knot, you want to come right underneath that. The hard part is you want this knot to be tucked inside. Right? And the more you knot it and the bigger you knot it, the more it's going to come on the outside. So then when I bury my tail, I want to make sure I go down inside. I go back into that hem area, or the closed area. All right, so that's our slip stitch. So if I were to open this up, see if I just lay it flat like this, it looks like a seam. Should look like pretty much like a seam on a garment. Okay, so those are our hand stitches. Again, we have blind hem. We have the cross stitch, and you can make that an obvious cross, or you can do it with the little bites. And then we have our slip stitch, which we'd use to close things up. Slip stitch is our extra credit. Blind hem and cross stitch are the required elements. And that does it for us for hand stitching.